Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV or the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra, which is better? Well, I will be comparing the specs of both phones side by side. At the end of this video, I will tell you which one I think is better and why. Let's get started with the design. The Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV measures 165mm in length, 71mm in width, and 8.2mm in thickness, while the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra measure 163.3mm in length, 73.6mm in width, and 8.4mm in thickness. In body size, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV will appear slightly slimmer to hold than the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra. The Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV weighs 185 grams lighter than the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra, which weighs 204 grams. The Xperia 1 Mark IV supports a single SIM, while the Axon 40 Ultra supports a dual SIM. The Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV has IP68 dust and water-resistant protection, while the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra does not. Looking at the display features, the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra has a 6.8 inches screen size while the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV has a 6.5 inches screen size. The screen of the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra will be slightly bigger than the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV. And the resolution of the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is a 1644 by 3840 pixels resolution display while the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra has an 1116 by 2480 pixels display resolution. With the PPI density of the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV being 643 PPI and the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra of 400 PPI, the Xperia 1 Mark IV will have a cleaner screen. The Xperia 1 Mark IV features an OLED display, while the Axon 40 Ultra features an AMOLED display type. Also, both phones have the same refresh rate of 120 Hz. On the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is a Corning Gorilla Glass protector, while the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra doesn't come with any. Please hit the subscribe button if you haven't done that. I will appreciate it if you do that. Performance-wise, both the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV and ZTE Axon 40 Ultra operate on an octa-core processor up to 3 GHz. Both phones will have a similar performance. The chipset on both the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV and the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra is a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1. In terms of memory, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV comes in 256GB to 512GB of storage. And the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra comes in 128GB to 1TB of storage. Meanwhile, the maximum RAM in the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is 12GB, and in the Axon 40 Ultra a 16GB of RAM. Both phones do not have a memory card slot. Looking at the camera of both phones, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV features a rear camera setup of a 12-megapixel wide-angle camera supported by a 12-megapixel ultra-wide-angle camera and another 12-megapixel telephoto camera with a 0.3-megapixel depth sensor. While the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra features a similar camera setup, a 64-megapixel wide-angle camera, supported by a 64-megapixel ultra-wide-angle camera, and a 64-megapixel telephoto camera. The ZTE Axon 40 Ultra will have a better camera compared to the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV. Looking at the video quality, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV can shoot in 4K at 120 frames per second, while the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra can shoot in 8K at 120 frames per second. The Axon 40 Ultra here will surpass the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV in shooting videos. Onto the front of the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is a 12-megapixel wide camera, while on the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra is a 16-megapixel under-display wide camera. The Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV selfie camera can shoot in 4K at 30 frames per second, while the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra can shoot in 1080p at 30 frames per second. The selfie video mode of the Xperia 1 Mark IV here will be better. Let's look at the battery capacity of both phones. The Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is powered with a 5000 mAh battery, the same as the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra. Meanwhile, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV has a fast charging of 30 watt, and the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra has a 65 watt fast charging. This means the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra will charge faster than the Sony Xperia 40 Ultra. Also, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV supports fast wireless charging and reverse wireless charging, while the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra does not. Both phones feature a loudspeaker, wireless LAN, 5G connectivity, Bluetooth, GPS, and NFC, but only the Xperia 1 Mark IV supports a 3.5 jack. Overall, the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra is better than the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV in the comparison score. Individually, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV beats the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra in its design, which is dust and water resistant for up to 30 minutes. While the ZTE Axon 40 Ultra beats the Xperia 1 Mark IV in camera, video, and memory size. In my opinion, ZTE Axon 40 Ultra only surpasses the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV in its 64-megapixel camera and up to 16GB RAM. But Sony Xperia is still excellent. Which do you think is better for you? Leave your thoughts in the comments section and don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Thank you.